Well, howdy everyone, and today I've got a Canon lens for you all that's a little bit different. The Canon EF70-300mm f4.5-5.6 IS USM DO for full frame or APS-C cameras. As you might guess from the DO at the end of its title and the green ring at the end of the lens itself, this is no ordinary 70-300mm telephoto zoom lens. It uses diffractive optics to make the lens shorter, giving us a slightly more compact telephoto lens than usual. Perhaps you can see the subtle rings on the front glass element which make this possible. So this might be a useful lens for people who want to save a little room in their kit bags or simply be a little less conspicuous while they're out shooting, for whatever reason. The lens is about 30% shorter than normal for a 70-300mm lens. Well, that's its unique selling point really. The first noticeable drawback is that this lens costs about £1,000 or about $1,300 US. That's a jaw-dropping amount of money for a 70-300mm telephoto zoom lens. This thing had better be really good. We all know that the 70-300mm focal range goes from slightly telephoto to long telephoto, as you can see here. It reaches even further if you use an APS-C camera. However, a disadvantage of this particular lens is that its maximum aperture of only f4.5-5.6 means that it only lets in a small amount of light, less than normal for a lens of this class. So it's not very useful for shooting in darker situations or for getting more out of focus backgrounds. The good news, however, is that this lens does have image stabilization. Here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it works quite smoothly and effectively, which could be especially nice for video work. Well, let's take a look at the build quality. The lens is very solid and nicely made, feeling quite a lot like a Canon L lens. I have to say that, although the lens is indeed a shorter telephoto lens than usual, it's actually quite fat and weighty, being a bit brick-like on your camera. Seems to defeat the point a little. On my copy of the lens, the zoom ring was actually a little bit stiff at wider angles, not moving particularly smoothly. There is a lock switch to keep the zoom ring in place at 70mm. That seemed to be necessary, as my copy of the lens suffered from a touch of zoom creep when held directly up or down. It wasn't too bad, but it did come into play when I held my camera around my neck. The front element of the lens would often end up falling down under its own weight. The lens has its focus ring at the front, which turns quite precisely, being well damped and smooth to turn. There is full-time manual focusing, so you can turn that focus ring safely at any time. The lens's USM autofocus motor is quite fast and very quiet, as you can see here. It also worked very accurately on my cameras. Overall, the lens is built rather nicely, working very well with no obvious weak points. But over time it seems like the zoom ring deteriorates a little. Let's take a look at image quality, starting on a full-frame camera, a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. Peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction are both turned on for this test. At 70mm and f4.5, the lens is fairly sharp in the middle of the image, but we see rather low contrast levels. Over in the corners, sharpness levels are good enough, although it's hardly a very punchy image. Stop down to f5.6 for a touch more sharpness, and at f8, those corners are very sharp, although contrast levels are still pretty low. It's the same story back in the middle of the image. Good sharpness, low contrast. Let's zoom in to 135mm. With the aperture open at f5 in the middle of the image, it's the same story. Good sharpness, low contrast levels. Over in the corners, the lens is starting to struggle a bit, looking a bit softer than before. However, stop down to f8 for a much sharper image from those corners and back into the middle. However, contrast levels do remain poor, leading the image to look a little bit weak. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 300mm. In the middle of the image at f5.6, the lens is noticeably soft, again with weak contrast levels. The corners of the image are even softer, unfortunately. Stop down to f8 or even down to f11 for a slight increase in sharpness in the corners and acceptable image quality in the middle of the picture. So what can we say overall? On a full-frame camera, the image quality is comparatively a bit weak. While there is little chromatic aberration, and also some acceptable sharpness at wider angles, the lens becomes too soft when you zoom in, and contrast levels overall are very disappointing. It's all a bit anemic. And now for the bad news, I have to test the lens on an APS-C camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 70D. This might not be good. At 70mm and f4.5, the lens is a touch soft in the middle, and again we see low contrast, but the corners fare no worse. At f5.6 it's the same story, but only when you stop down to f8 do we see an improvement in sharpness in those corners, and back in the middle of the image. So not a great start. At 135mm and f5, there is a little sharpness in the middle of the image. Unfortunately, the corners are rather soft. At f8 there is a slight improvement, and stop down to f11 for reasonably sharp corners. That's a pretty dark aperture to be working with, though. Finally, let's zoom in to 300mm. At f5.6 the lens is quite soft in the middle of the image, and again, the contrast levels are feeble. The corners are even worse. There is a very slight improvement if you stop down to f8, and at least there's no visible chromatic aberration. Back in the middle of the image, the picture quality is just barely acceptable. Even stopping the aperture down to f11 doesn't really yield any improvement. So, considering the exorbitant price of this camera lens, it puts in a somewhat dreadful performance on an APS-C camera, being really quite soft. It's a bit of a joke really, especially considering that Canon's new 55-250mm STM lens is much sharper, smaller, and costs about a quarter of the price. That might be a much better idea if you have an APS-C camera. Let's look at distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. At 70mm there is good news. We see almost no distortion and very little darkness in the corners of the image, even at f4.5. If you zoom in to 135mm, we begin to notice some pincushion distortion. Zoom all the way into 300mm and that pincushion distortion becomes really quite strong. So the lens throws a bit of distortion your way when you zoom in, but at least vignetting doesn't seem to be much of a problem, which is nice. The lens can focus down to about 1.4 meters. That is not particularly close for a lens of this type, but it's just about enough for pictures of small subjects. At f5.6, picture quality is a real issue, with images looking very soft, with very low contrast. Stop down to f8 for a big improvement in sharpness, although as usual, the contrast is just not really there. Moving on, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. Not well, really. We see flaring and even lower levels of contrast, as if that were imaginable. Ho-hum. Finally, let's look at the lens's bokeh. Its narrow maximum aperture means that it can't really give you the most out-of-focus backgrounds. But actually, the quality of those out-of-focus areas is normally very smooth, without being distracting in any way. But at the end of the day, nice quality bokeh can't save a lens with such anemic optics. It may be a bit physically shorter than others, but this lens is also stubby and weighty and yields often soft images with wishy-washy contrast levels, performing particularly badly on APS-C cameras. It's also alarmingly expensive. If you really need a physically small kit for telephoto photography, then you'd be much better off getting a decent APS-C camera with a Canon 55-250mm STM lens, which is a very nice piece of equipment. You could probably buy that whole setup for much less of the price of this Diffractive Optics lens alone. and give the rest of the money away to someone or some cause who really needs it. In my opinion, sadly, the 70 to 300mm do is more of a 70 to 300mm don't. Not recommended.